He's coming back this week. Last week was on a Declaration of Independence. Today is on the Constitution and its spiritual foundations. Anyway, Steve Jackson earned his Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering at Purdue. This is back in '68. Majoring in structures and minors in economics and philosophy. He worked on the manned space programs most of his professional career. Really heavily involved in Boeing, also involved in the Boeing Christian Fellowship. I didn't realize they even had one. Anyway, he lives in Fountain Valley. He's a member of the Huntington Baptist Church. And he is, I could spend 5 minutes reading this thing. It's just incredible. This man is a mighty man of God. He knows the Word of God. He understands the Constitution. And he knows enough about our culture, how we work and how we tick. And he has answers for a lot of the things that trouble us. Anyway, without further ado, Steve Jackson.
Thank you very much for that kind intro. I'm not sure who that guy was he was talking about, but first of all, I'd like to thank Pastor Ron. It's an honor to be asked to fill in for him while he's away. I'd like to invite Terry Miller for getting me invited here. Also to Ted and Dawn and everybody who helped out with the technical aspects. Without them, these things couldn't happen. I hope you all enjoyed the presentation last week on the foundations that are laid down, the great principles of our Declaration of Independence, and I hope they contributed to your enjoyment and appreciation for your Independence Day. Likewise, I hope that the presentation today will contribute to your understanding and appreciation for Constitution Day, which comes up on September the 17th. We're going to talk today about the Founders' Constitution, which was written with a distinct biblical worldview. That's a controversial thing to say these days, but it shouldn't be too controversial in a crowd like this. But there are different versions of the Constitution, so to speak, that have been handed down through various Supreme Court decisions and case law and all of that. And they very much complicated the issue. They've made a real mess of things. But the original Constitution is written in plain English. Any person with a decent education can understand it. And it should be read and interpreted according to the original intent of the founders, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. But the little cartoon on the screen, I apologize that it's a little bit fuzzy, but there's the USS Constitution sailing along, and they're obviously in a bit of distress at the moment, and it says, "It's time we read the owner's manual." Well, that's funny, but it's also very true, and so we're here today to talk about the owner's manual, the U.S. Constitution. I titled the presentation, "Organizing the Powers," and I'll explain that very shortly where that comes from. The U.S. Constitution is supreme law of the land. It says so in Article 6. This Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. It goes on to say that all public officers shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. And that includes local and state and county officials too, by the way. It is not God's perfect law. However, it is man's best law. William Gladstone, who was Great Britain's prime minister during the 1860s to 1890s, said the U.S. Constitution is, quote, "the greatest piece of work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man," unquote. It is organic law. It is the organic law, which means that it's the basis upon which all federal laws are made and enforced or negated. It organizes and limits the powers of the federal government so that it has only enough powers to secure we the people's safety and happiness. Those concepts come right from the Declaration of Independence, which says to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles. That's the Declaration of Independence, and that's what we looked at last week. And it goes on to say, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. That is what the Constitution does. That is the purpose of the Constitution. It's written on 4 sheets of parchment, and obviously you can't read all of that, but most of the statutes that are passed by Congress these days are many times longer than that. But the supreme law of the land is written on 4 pages of parchment, and it consists of 7 articles. Article 1 deals with the legislative branch. That's really where most of the power is. Article 2 deals with the executive branch. Article 3 deals with the judicial branch of government. Article 4 deals with relationships between the state and the federal government and among the states. Article 5 describes amendment processes. Article 6 contains that supremacy clause and also the oath that all officials must take. Article 7 explained the ratification process. That was useful one time. That happened, and now that isn't really relevant anymore. So those 7 articles. James Madison said that every word of it decides a question between power and liberty. And I think you'll see why he said that as we move along. We need to take a quick look at why we have government in the first place. Why do we need government? Well, it's really quite simple, and it's a biblical concept. Man is sinful, self-interested, and corruptible. Have you noticed? Jeremiah 17 tells us that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. In Romans 3:22 we read, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." James Madison, the father of the Constitution, said if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Well, that isn't quite theologically correct because, as you know, 1/3 of the angels fell, and even angels need order, and there are ranks of angels, angels and archangels and so forth. So even angels need order. So civil government is necessary. It is to be an enforcer of God's natural law, which we talked about last week, and it is one of 3 human institutions that were specifically ordained by God himself. Okay, that civil government is one of the 3. Can somebody name one of the other 2 human institutions ordained by God? Anybody? The family, did you say? The family and church, that's the 3rd. Okay, very good. Family, church, and government. Those are the 3 human institutions that are ordained by God himself. So what is the purpose of government? Well, it's to protect our natural rights, which are God-given. Again, we learned that last week when we looked at the Declaration. In order to do that, it must restrain the exercise of sin. We read in Romans 13:3 and 4, "Rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. For civil government is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil." That's the biblical model for what civil government is supposed to be. Unfortunately, many aspects of civil government today, even in our own country, have kind of gone away from this. And there are those who actually teach that you must obey the government, period, because Romans 13 says so. But it goes on to say, it's a minister of God to you for good, and if you do what's evil and so forth. When the civil government ceases to do those things and starts persecuting rather than protecting your God-given rights, then you have a right to some sort of certainly petitioning for redress of grievances. And if that doesn't do it, perhaps some sort of civil disobedience is necessary. But the point is, rulers are, the idea of civil government is ordained by God, and it is to do these things. That was God's plan for civil government. Also, it has to maintain order. Okay? Ben Franklin wrote in the Pennsylvania Gazette in 1735, "All true happiness, as all that is truly beautiful, can only result from order." That sounds like Ben Franklin. If you've read anything about the life of Ben Franklin, he was a very orderly individual. Had a few character flaws here and there. That's a whole other story. Don't we all? 1 Timothy 2:2 speaks that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity, because civil government is necessary to maintain order, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. But there's a disturbing fact in government. Most of you have heard this one. Lord Acton said it well. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So that leads to the great dilemma of government, which James Madison in the Federalist 51 worded very nicely. He says, "In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. That is quite a task." So what are the keys to good government? I submit that it comes down to 2 things: character and limits. Those 2. And we're going to take a look at each one. First of all, character. Proverbs 29:2 tells us that when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked beareth rule, the people sigh. Freedom is impossible without virtue. That's a fact that people today seem to forget, that freedom is impossible without virtue. Virtue on the part of the people and virtue on the part of rulers. It's particularly true in a system like America, where we choose our leaders from among the people. John Adams tells us that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other, because it allows too much freedom. So it's made only for a moral and religious people. George Washington, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Those words come from his farewell address. Everyone needs to read George Washington's farewell address. By the way, when the founders used the word religion, they usually meant Christianity. Most founders were Christians, and Christianity was grafted into the older tree of Judaism. Most features of American government come out of the Old Testament. Thus, it is historically accurate to say that the USA has a Judeo-Christian heritage. Ben Franklin said, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have need of masters. And if we have masters, what does that make us? Slaves, precisely." What is freedom? That's a very important question. And I like to ask the question, and when we have more time, I invite input from the audience, particularly young people, trying to come up with the answer to what is freedom. It usually comes down to something like this: freedom to make my own choices, freedom to choose, freedom to do what I want, basically that kind of thing. Well, Dr. John Eidsmoe, who is the constitutional law professor for the Institute on the Constitution, which is the 12-week series that I teach, I like what he says about freedom, and I think he really nails it. Freedom is not so much the right to choose. Freedom is the result of making right choices. And that is proven by experience down through the ages. William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania, wrote to the Tsar of Russia these words: "Those who will not be governed by God will be ruled by tyrants." That's part of natural law. It's always been that way, and it always will. If you cannot be self-governing by God, the Holy Spirit in you, you will end up being ruled by tyrants. History has proven that, and our founding fathers knew that very well. The other key to good government is, of course, limits. Thomas Jefferson said, "In questions of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution." The Institute on the Constitution, the 12-week series again, John Eidsmoe talks about the Founding Fathers' five-fold formula. You like alliteration? It consists of these 5 parts: limited delegated powers, a vertical division of powers, a horizontal separation of powers, checks and balances, those things we've all heard about and learned about in civics, and reserved individual rights. And that leads very naturally into the topic of the doctrines of the Constitution, which is our primary subject for the day. I've chosen 7 doctrines to examine today. The first is fidelity to declaration principles. We looked at all of those last week. I chose 13, but just a quick summary. I'm sorry, we got to do the principles first. The second principle is original intent. The third principle is the doctrine of enumerated powers. The fourth is separation of powers. The fifth is balance of powers. The sixth is representation. And the seventh is reserved individual rights. Okay. Now, fidelity to declaration principles, or first principles. A review from last week. They consist of things like natural law, truth, the God of the Bible, who is our creator, God-given unalienable rights, the concept of equality, what is the purpose of government, that government is a social compact operating with the consent of the governed, nationhood was God's idea, and sovereignty, the sovereignty of individuals and of nations. So, first doctrine of the Constitution is fidelity to those declaration principles, building on that foundation. There was a Supreme Court case in 1891 where the majority declared that the Constitution is but the letter of which the Declaration of Independence is the thought and the spirit, and it is always safe to read the letter of the Constitution in the spirit of the Declaration. In fact, you must. Some say, well, these are nice principles, but the Declaration is not law. That is not true. On January 3rd, 2007, actually they've done this other times, Congress placed the Declaration of Independence at the beginning of the U.S. Code under the heading, The Organic Laws of the United States of America. So Declaration of Independence is absolutely part of the U.S. Code. It is law. That's fidelity to Declaration principles. The next one is original intent. So how do we know what original intent is? We hear a lot of people talking about it, but how do you really know what was the original intent? Something that happened in 1787. Well, it's simple. You read the Constitution, you read the Declaration of Independence, you read the Federalist Papers. They're written to explain the Constitution to people who initially opposed it. You read their speeches and private letters. They were prolific writers, and we benefit a great deal from studying their speeches, their private letters. Their real thoughts, their real intent come through very clearly when you read those prime source documents. I advise you to stay away from some things that have been written in recent years that are critical of the Founding Fathers, that question our system of government and so forth. Go back to the prime sources. Go back to these wise men who were led by God to give us this great, magnificent document. Jefferson said, on every question of construction, carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted, recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, courts do that all the time now, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. Common sense. The idea of a living Constitution, and you've all heard the term, is that its meaning changes and evolves with time. It was invented in the early 20th century by self-proclaimed progressives who did not want to be limited in their utopian plans. Woodrow Wilson was one of the champions of the living Constitution. He had great plans for the federal government to do much more for the people and kept being bound down by the chains of the Constitution. He was very frustrated by that. Well, what happened? This opened the door to godless totalitarian systems like socialism, Marxism, and communism, which the founders wrote the Constitution to prevent. Those terms didn't exist per se in those days, but the concepts, that political philosophy of collectivism and so forth, was very much alive, and they wrote the Constitution to make that kind of thing impossible to happen in our country. George Washington said, if, in the opinion of the people, the distribution of the constitutional powers be at any particular wrong, if there's an error there, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation. It is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. So how do you spot usurpation of power? You need to know the next doctrine, the doctrine of enumerated powers. George Washington said, government is force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. Quick review. The purpose of government is to secure our God-given rights by restraining the exercise of sin and maintaining order. The problem is that those who govern have the same sin nature as those they govern. So, the framers' solution: limit federal powers to matters that only the federal government must, of necessity, govern. Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, the body of the Constitution itself, begins with these words: all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. Okay? Now, our Congress today has taken an eraser, and they think it says, all legislative powers shall be vested in Congress. You think I'm exaggerating? Come on, Paul. Sometimes it takes him a minute to decide to speak. Okay, it worked during our rehearsal. Let's see if we can go back and get to that point again and see what happens.
Article 1 states that all legislative powers are vested in Congress.
He paused at the two words. He saw them. He did not read them. Interesting. No, Article 1, Section 1 says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in Congress. Herein granted. And it proceeds to list 18 powers over which the Congress may legislate, over which the Congress may make law. They involve things, important national things like war, naturalization, and so forth and so on. So, the founders' solution was to first limit the powers, and those two little words, herein granted, go a long way to doing that. An illustration of why Madison said every word of it decides a question between power and liberty, those two little words. Limit the powers and list or enumerate the limited powers in writing. James Madison said the powers of the federal government are enumerated. It can only operate in certain cases. It has legislative powers on defined and limited objects beyond which it cannot extend its jurisdiction. Okay, example, Article 1, Section 8, that lists those 18 powers, ends with these words. Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Now, once again, the Congress has taken their erasers, and they think that it says, we have the power to make all laws which we think are necessary and proper.
So now I'm elected, now I'm in. I've got the power to draft, lobby, and shape the laws that govern the United States of America. Fabulous. Mrs. Hobart Flynn, is there any hard limit that I have in terms of what legislation I'm allowed to touch? Are there any limits on the laws that I can write or influence?
There's no limit.
So there's none. So I can be totally funded by Big Pharma, come in, write Big Pharma laws, and there's no limits to that whatsoever.
That's right.
Okay, so awesome.
I wonder if any of them have ever read the Constitution. It says to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. What powers? The foregoing powers. The 18 we just listed. It doesn't say make laws and anything that you think is necessary and proper. That's known as the elastic clause, by the way. And it does allow a certain elasticity, but not on powers over which you can legislate. In fairness, it goes on to say, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, because in a couple of other spots in the Constitution, there are one or two other miscellaneous powers granted to Congress. But Article 1, Section 8 pretty much lists all the objects, all the matters over which Congress can make law. If it's not there, constitutionally, they cannot do it. God's written word placed limits upon Israel's government structure back in the Old Testament. It was a structure of kings. Remember, they weren't supposed to have kings, but they insisted on having kings, and God said, fine, you ask for kings, you're not going to like it, you're not going to like the results, but you can have kings. However, there are some rules, okay? And here are some of the rules in Deuteronomy 17. Set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your countrymen. You may not put a foreigner over you. Where do you think our founders got the Article 2 requirement that the president be a natural-born citizen? Deuteronomy comes right out of the Old Testament. By the way, we don't have a great deal of time to spend on the topic, but the term is discussed a lot. What does natural-born citizen mean? Every time the issue comes up, you see all the so-called experts on the TV trying to tell you what their interpretation of what natural-born citizen means. Let me tell you what it means. It comes from Emmerich de Vattel's 1758 book called The Law of Nations, Book 1, Chapter 19, Section 212. You can look this up on the internet yourself if you don't believe me, where it says, the natives or natural-born citizens are those born in the country of parents, plural, who are citizens, of parents who are citizens. What could be more natural than to be born of parents, both of whom are citizens? Therefore, you are a natural-born citizen. Okay, now don't confuse that with naturalization, which is an entirely different term. But to be a natural-born citizen, you get one shot at that. The moment you're born, if your parents are citizens, you are and always will be a natural-born citizen. If both of your parents are not citizens, you are not, cannot, and will never be a natural-born citizen. You can process that through with some recent candidates for president who were definitely not, one of them served as president, definitely not a natural-born citizen. Okay. It goes on to say, he shall not multiply horses for himself. What's all that about? What is all of that about? Well, you have to understand Old Testament Bible times. In those times, the horse was considered the ultimate weapon of war, horses and chariots. You weren't going to defeat an army that had horses and chariots. The Egyptians chased the Israelites to the Red Sea and paid a price for that, horses and chariots. They were considered the ultimate weapon of war. So the king was not to accumulate vast numbers of horses. The key words are really for himself. For himself. Okay? Kings were always, throughout history, accumulating wealth and power and stuff to do things they wanted to do. He's king. He can do anything he wants to do. Well, we were not to have that kind of a system. Israel was not to have that kind of a system either. He, the king, shall not multiply horses for his own selfish purposes. It has to be for the good of the nation. That's the point. Nor shall he greatly increase silver or gold for himself. Same idea. Okay? His heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen. In this country, even the president must pass the law, must follow the laws that are passed legally by Congress. Okay? No one is above the law. He may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left. Well, in those days, they were talking about God's law, 10 Commandments, etc. But today, in the context of the discussion today, what is our commandment? What is our president to do? Follow the Constitution. That's our commandment, the supreme law of our land. Can't turn from the right or to the left. By the way, these concepts are all laid out in Anderson and Belisle's book, Contending for the Constitution. It's a nice companion piece for defending the Declaration that I shared last week. The one that he doesn't mention, it comes from Ezra 7:24. You have no authority to impose taxes on any of the priests or other workers at this house of God. For most of our history, churches enjoyed something called tax immunity for this very reason. That became tax exemption after Johnson got the so-called Johnson Amendment passed that put a muzzle on pastors, what they can and cannot talk about from the pulpits. In fact, in order to enjoy that tax-exempt status, you have to file for tax-exempt status, and when you do that, you have just sold your right to free speech. It didn't used to be that way. We used to have tax immunity, where all churches were just simply immune for any restrictions on what was taught. In fact, early pastors in the colonial period, largely responsible for the spirit of the American Revolution, by the way, and the Brits understood that very well. They were free to talk about anything, and they were expected to deliver election sermons at election time and inform the people what the issues are, who the good candidates are, who the bad candidates are. The people demanded that. Why? Because not only was he going to instruct them from God's Word, but he was the best educated man in those communities. He had been to college and seminary. Very few other people had. They trusted him, they trusted his knowledge and wisdom, and they spoke freely about these matters. Tax immunity. Article 1, Section 8 grants some 18 powers to the Congress. We've already mentioned that. Article 2, Sections 2 and 3 grants some 13 powers to the President, a few less. Article 3, Section 2 grants only 5 powers to the Supreme Court. By the way, the Supreme Court is the only federal court mentioned in the Constitution. It's the only one that's required, the only one set up by the Constitution. All of the other federal courts were set up by the Congress. They have the right to establish more or to disestablish federal courts as they wish. Okay. Madison in the Federalist 45 does a great job of explaining enumerated powers. Everybody should read it. Powers delegated to the proposed Constitution, by the proposed Constitution, to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. The powers reserved to the states, the several states, will extend to all the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. John Adams said, "Nothing is more dreaded than the national government meddling with religion." And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Since the federal government is denied power over religion, any religious qualification for federal office would be irrelevant, wouldn't it? That's why that Article 6, Paragraph 3 says that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. In other words, if you're running for federal office, there shall be no religious test. Why? Because they don't do religion in Washington. It's off limits. It would be irrelevant. Well, we're far from all of that today, but that was the intent in the beginning. Thomas Jefferson said, "I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground, the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." You're looking for a statement of the doctrine of enumerated powers? The 10th Amendment. It's right there, black and white. Jefferson again, in questions of power then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. And we need to use that 10th Amendment and the doctrine of enumerated powers to do just that. Very important doctrine, one of which is largely ignored today. The next doctrine is that of separation of powers. This will probably be a review for most of you. Thomas Jefferson in 1816, "What has destroyed liberty and rights of man in every government which has ever existed under the sun? The generalizing and concentrating all cares and powers in one governing body." Jefferson 1821, "When all government shall be drawn to Washington as the center of all power, it will render powerless the checks provided of one government on another, the states to the federal, and will become as oppressive as the government from which we separated." The states formed this government. They were the creator of the federal government. They had been through the King George experience, and they didn't want a repeat of that in some place called, far-off place called Washington. It was New York originally, soon became Washington. Madison in the Federalist 51 said, "In the compound Republic of America, the power surrendered by the people is first divided vertically between distinct governments, and then the portion allotted to each individual horizontally among the distinct and separate departments. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people." We call this federalism, this vertical separation of powers. It's really nothing more than different levels of government divided into their own areas of sovereign authority with a flow of powers. It's a question of jurisdiction. This has been terribly clouded today. Very few people understand this at all. But we're going to spend a little time on this and diagram it as follows. First of all, God is sovereign over all. That was the biblical worldview of the founders. Sam Adams, at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, said, "We have this day restored the sovereign to whom all men ought to be obedient. He reigns in heaven." Well, God created individuals, and God flows down to those individuals powers and rights. We learned about God-given rights last time. Each individual is a sovereign individual. That concept, that gift comes from God, our power, our sovereignty, and our rights. Self-government, that's the level of self-government, individuals. Individuals voluntarily join together in families and churches, two of the other human institutions ordained by God. And when you do that, you surrender a little bit of your absolute sovereignty to the family unit or to the church structure in which you're a part. Families and churches, of course, exist in the context of cities, municipalities, and so forth. Some power and authority flows down to those municipalities to do zoning laws and that kind of thing for the betterment of the health and welfare of the people in that community. Municipalities, of course, exist in the context of counties. Certain things are handled at the county level because that's the appropriate way to do it. Some power flows to the states. Notice that there's decreasing power with each step. Less and less gets flowed down. And the states, of course, eventually formed the federal government originally under the Articles of Confederation and later under the Constitution. And some limited power and authority flowed down to this new creature called the federal government. Madison said, "Much more must every man who becomes a member of any particular civil society do it with a saving of his allegiance to the universal sovereign." This concept is kind of like an inverted triangle. You can probably notice that. Or an inverted pyramid, perhaps. It's one nation under God. This is really the diagram of what one nation under God is all about. That's beginning to look familiar. There we go. So once again, the next time you see the flag and look at the 7 red stripes, you can think of the 7 levels of government, with God at the top, and then individuals and families and churches, municipalities, counties, states, and the federal government. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in 1851, In the United States, the sovereign authority is religious. There is no country in which the Christian religion retains a greater influence, he was from France, than in America, and there can be no greater proof of its utility and of its conformity to human nature than that its influence is most powerfully felt over the most enlightened and free nation of the earth. Now, of course, the progressives have a different view of all of this. Their view looks something like this. The federal government is sovereign over all. The states exist to carry out the will of the federal government, and so forth down through the counties and municipalities. All of families and churches are pretty much under the burden of all those levels of government. And then individuals, and sometimes just to make them feel good, they'll still throw God in just so they feel good. But the real power is the federal government, in their opinion, and everything else flows down from there. Well, that's, of course, totally upside down. There are a couple of sub-doctrines that go with this. One is one called interposition, and it works something like this. Let's say the federal government throws off its chains, gets puffed up, and tries to make a move on families and churches. Well, if they do that, that has weakened families and churches. In some cases, we could give lots of examples of that. Eventually, it would destroy families and churches. So, obviously, that's not a good thing. Madison said in the Virginia resolutions, resolved that the General Assembly of Virginia explicitly and peremptorily declare that it views the powers of the federal government as limited by the plain sense and intention of the instrument constituting the compact, the Constitution, as no further valid than they are authorized by the grants enumerated in that compact, and that in case of exercise of other powers not granted by the said compact, the states who are parties thereto have the right and are in duty bound to interpose for arresting the progress of the evil and for maintaining within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them. This is why local and state and county officials all take an oath to the Constitution, so they can spot usurpations of federal power and interpose on behalf of the people that they represent and whose liberties they are supposed to be protecting against a potentially tyrannical, usurping federal government. So it goes like this. Federal government throws off its chains, gets puffed up, tries to move on families and churches, but the state steps in and says, no, what you're doing is unconstitutional. You have not been granted that power by the Constitution. This kind of thing used to happen. It actually has happened fairly recently. Many of the provisions of Obamacare were outright rejected by certain states. That's interposition. We've seen it in modern times. If the state doesn't take that action, then the counties can do so. There's a couple more levels of government here before we get to families and churches. County sheriffs are the highest elected law enforcement officials in the country. County sheriff has tremendous powers, whether they realize it or not. There are people like Richard Mack, who was sheriff in Arizona a few years ago. And the feds passed some onerous gun control thing where county sheriffs were mandated to enforce certain very restrictive gun requirements and this and that and the other that had been passed by the federal government. And Sheriff Richard Mack knows his Constitution, and he knows about interposition. And he told the feds to go pound sand. We are not going to enforce that unconstitutional act in this county. Well, of course, they tried to prosecute him. He took his case to the Supreme Court, and once in a while they get it right. They got it right. He was exonerated, and his county did not have to enforce those unconstitutional laws. County sheriffs, very important in this process. Municipalities, city councils. The problem with this is the feds come along with money in hand to cities, states, counties, everything. And they say, hey, here's some money. We just want you to implement some program. And they can very seldom say no to that money. But there's a stick attached to the carrot if you follow some federal program. And it happens every day. But each of these levels of government and the officials that man them have a responsibility to defend the Constitution. They all took an oath to it, and that's why, for interposition, okay? So hard for them to say no to the so-called federal dollars. So anyway, the idea is to put the federal government back in its proper place. Okay. Nullification is the other sub-doctrine. Thomas Jefferson, the several states who formed the Constitution, being sovereign and independent, have the unquestionable right to judge of its infraction, and a nullification by those sovereignties of all unauthorized acts done under color of that instrument is the rightful remedy. Hamilton wrote in Federal 33, that laws made not in pursuance of the Constitution, which is what Article 6 says, that all laws made in pursuance of the Constitution are the supreme law of the land along with the Constitution. But those which are not in pursuance of the Constitution are, quote, merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such, close quote, by Hamilton in the Federalist Papers. Okay, there are some powers forbidden to the states. In Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, it says some things states can't do. States shall not enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation. They can't coin money. They can't pass bills of attainder, ex post facto laws, laws impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any titles of nobility. That's titles of nobility thing has to do with the Old Testament concept again about accumulating wealth to himself and titles and that kind of thing. Well, it applies to our president and to other officers of the federal government. But states can't do certain things, okay? Very similar, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power or engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. Now, there are headlines in the news for the last few years that relate directly to all of these things, where governors and other people in states are just flat out violating this stuff. It happens every day. The exception about no state shall go to war unless invaded or in such imminent danger or that will not admit a delay. I think of the southern border states. Arizona was trying to enforce their borders during the last administration because the federal government wasn't doing their job. So the governor of Arizona tried to help out and do the job and do something about the border. Of course, that administration didn't care much for that, and stepped in and said, no, hey, that's the job of the federal government. Well, he was right, but they weren't doing it. So the point is, they were in fact being invaded. If you look up the definition of invaded, it's not necessarily an armed invasion. It can be a mass number of people crossing a border for the purpose of plundering wealth that doesn't belong to them or whatever. That is an invasion also. And so a state, theoretically, could go to war to protect itself, because that's an exception here. There's among the things that states can't do. They can if they're being invaded. Anyway, interesting stuff. Madison, Federalist 47, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Thus we have a horizontal separation of powers with three branches of government, each vested with different powers. Of course, the legislative has something like 18 powers, the executive 13, and the judicial 5. Vested, by the way, it's an important word, and it's one of those wonderfully powerful words like the word rights that we looked at last week, which unfortunately is very much misunderstood and abused today. But vested means permanently and irrevocably fixed. So when it says all legislative power herein granted is vested in a Congress, it means that all lawmaking power that's authorized in the Constitution is permanently and irrevocably placed with the Congress. It can't change with time. They can't relinquish that power, which carries with it a responsibility, to another branch of government, like the president, through executive orders, to the courts, who make law all the time, at least they think they do, with their decisions. It's permanently and irrevocably fixed in Congress, so that your congressman can be held accountable at the next election if they mess it up. Okay? But we've lost this separation of powers concept. Powers vested in one branch may not be exercised by another. That's not the non-delegation doctrine. Now, compare and contrast these three branches with what it says in Isaiah 33:22. It says, the Lord is our judge, our lawgiver, and our king. Well, the Lord God is all of three of those things, and he is God. He's all powerful, he's all wise, he's all knowing, etc., and he can handle it. He is loving and he is just, and he is fair, and so forth. So he can handle that. But when it comes to human government, we must separate those three powers into three different branches of government, and that's what we do. We do horizontal separation of powers. So that's separation of powers. Now, balance of powers. Madison said, to give those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachment of the others. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The three branches of the federal government are supposed to be jostling with each other for power. That was by design. Here's a diagram of checks and balances in action. And there's a lot of detail in here which we simply don't have time to look at today. But the check marks indicate where the power of checking and balancing the other branch lies. You notice with each power, the check is on one side or the other. You'll notice the predominance of power on behalf of the Congress. Congress has a lot of checks and balances on the other two branches. One of the powers that Congress has is the power to declare war. Okay? The president then becomes the commander-in-chief. At least that's the plan. But war making is an incredibly weighty decision, and it, by rights, must be made by much deliberation by the representatives of we, the people. That's why Congress is granted in Article 1, Section 8, the power to declare war. Because John Adams said, "Great is the guilt of an unnecessary war." But once Congress, the representatives of the people, have committed the wealth and the blood that it's going to take to prosecute that war, then the president becomes commander-in-chief in the interest of efficiency and dispatch. Beautiful system that the founders designed. Unfortunately, we've strayed away from that in recent years. So we're looking between the powers between president and Congress. Again, don't have time to go into all of that. Balances between Congress and the courts. Again, the checks and balances predominantly, or Congress have checks and balances over the courts. The only one in which the courts have checks and balances on the Congress is something called judicial review, which is not in the Constitution, but it grew out of the Marbury versus Madison decision in 1803, in which, I'm trying to think of the name, Chief Justice, his name escapes me, told us that all laws which are repugnant to the Constitution are null and void, and he was right. And in our early history, the Supreme Court was striking down unconstitutional laws, and rightfully so. Things like the income tax was struck down repeatedly until we got the 16th Amendment. Lots of unconstitutional things were struck down, and rightfully so. Today, they strike down things as being unconstitutional if they don't like them. Balance in the courts, there's some balance there with the president, impeachment process. If the president's impeached and it goes to the Senate for trial, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court sits in authority over that proceeding. Anyway, that's checks and balances. Thomas Jefferson, our government is now taking so steady a course as to show by what road it will pass to destruction, to wit, by consolidation first, it's consolidation of powers, and then corruption, its necessary consequence. The engine of consolidation will be the federal judiciary. The other two branches, the corrupting and corrupted instruments. Boy, was he a prophet. He understood very well the dangers of out-of-control federal courts. So that's balance of powers, at least the way it was designed by the founders. Representation. Article 4, Section 4 says the United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a republican form of government. Webster's 1828 dictionary defines republic as a state in which the exercise of sovereign power is lodged in representatives elected by the people. The Old Testament contains examples of representative government. Moses was encouraged by his father-in-law to choose representatives and judges to help him lead Israel. We're familiar with that story. He was overloaded. You be the people's representative before God, but select out of all the people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain, and place these as leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and tens. First of all, we see the importance of character in our representatives. We also see the different levels of government outlined here. Leaders of tens, leaders of thousands, leaders of hundreds, etc. In the New Testament, we have representation. The first century church structure is an example of representative government. Jesus said, "I have come in my Father's name." There's the ultimate representative. And the 12 disciples were told to select from among you 7 men of good reputation, full of wisdom, whom we may be in charge of the task, assisting widows, other things that were being done by representatives. St. Paul said, if any man aspires to the office of overseer, he must be above reproach. There's that element of character again in our representatives. Noah Webster wrote history textbooks. He did a lot of things, not just write dictionaries. He said, the brief exposition of the Constitution will unfold to young persons the principles of Republican government, and our citizens should early understand that the genuine source of correct Republican principles is the Bible, particularly the New Testament or the Christian religion. H.G. Wells, we all know who he was. He said of the U.S. Constitution, its spirit is indubitably Christian. Okay, representation, of course, at the federal level happens in Congress, and during those debates, this was huge. The large states wanted representation by population for obvious reasons. The small states wanted equal representation, as it had been in the First, Second Continental Congresses, where each state had one vote. They reached a two-house compromise, wherein we have a House of Representatives and a Senate. The House of Representatives is portioned by population. The large states win. The Senate is equal by states. The small states win in the upper house. The House of Representatives are selected by the people. Originally, the Senate was selected by its state legislators. That was the plan. That was changed by the 17th Amendment, unfortunately. The House of Representatives represents the people. The Senate represented the states as sovereign entities. When we no longer had the state senator, the national senators appointed by state legislators, they're elected by the people now, they are essentially accountable to the people, just like the House of Representatives. That was not the plan of the founders. The Senate was to be responsible for maintaining the sovereignty of their states that sent them to Congress. The House is where most of the power lies because they hold the power of the purse, but the Senate, on the other hand, is more stable. The House serves short terms. Most power, shortest terms. See the beauty of that design? Senate, longer terms, 6 years. By the way, this great debate is portrayed very nicely in the DVD, A More Perfect Union, which comes with a study guide that can be used for teaching this in homeschools or schools or whatever. Okay, here's a question for you. Must representatives do the will of the people? Yes or no? Good work. I hear lots of yeses and I hear lots of nos, and that's the right answer. Yes and no. This is important. Stay with me. The preamble begins with these words, "We the people," and that certifies the Constitution is the sovereign will of the people. And a rep's oath binds him to that. Okay? On the other hand, if popular voter sentiment asks a rep to do something not authorized by the Constitution, his oath forbids him from doing that. And he needs to explain, no, this is not an enumerated power. I am not granted as a congressman. The federal government is not granted power over this object. We can't legislate in these matters. I cannot do this because my oath forbids me from doing it. The power under the Constitution will always be in the people, so says George Washington. It is entrusted for certain defined purposes and for a certain limited period to representatives of their own choosing. And whenever it is executed contrary to their interest, their servants can and indubitably will be recalled, either at the next election or through some sort of an impeachment process. Okay? Thomas Jefferson said, "We in America do not have government by the majority. We have government by the majority who participate. All tyranny needs to gain a foothold is for people of good conscience to remain silent. Too many Christians have fallen into that trap for too many years." Republics are created by the virtue, public spirit, and intelligence of the citizens. They fall when the wise are banished from the public councils because they dare be honest. And the profligate are rewarded because they flatter the people in order to betray them. That is politics today. Joseph Story, U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice. James Madison, "A well-instructed people alone can be permanently a free people." That's representation. Now, regard to individual rights. We're almost there. God's good gift to individuals includes natural rights and the liberty to exercise them. James 1:17 says that every good thing bestowed and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. John Adams reminds us that you have rights antecedent to all earthly governments, rights that cannot be repealed or restrained by human laws, rights derived from the great legislator, capital G, capital L, of the universe. Our rights come from God. They pre-exist any human government. The Bill of Rights has a preamble. I only learned that a few years ago myself. It contains these words: "To prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers, that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added." The Bill of Rights is really Bill of Government shalt nots. If you ever read them, you notice that they're all written in the negative. Congress shall make no law. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, etc. Because they are pre-existing rights. They already existed. That Bill of Rights doesn't grant you a single right, and neither does the Constitution. They were pre-existing. The Constitution and the government at all levels exist merely to protect their pre-existing God-given rights. It protects individuals' rights from abuse by the federal government. It is the federal Constitution, after all. Later misapplication of the 14th Amendment and something called the Incorporation Doctrine has led to many lawsuits being filed in federal courts for matters that belong back in the states, because the states all have their own Bill of Rights, which are substantially the same thing. But somehow or another, the federal government and its Bill of Rights, which was intended only to protect us from the federal government's abuse, has now been misused to apply to things that happen in the states. It's part of the confusion of jurisdiction again. I'm going to skip the Ninth Amendment thing. That's kind of a detail. So, the best defense of individual rights is a republic and not a democracy. You notice we've talked about our republic a number of times in this lecture. I've never referred to it as a democracy. The Founding Fathers did not either. And you will not find the word in any founding document, and we pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands, and so forth. This comes as a shock to some people, because that word democracy has become so endeared to so many people, they don't want to let go of it. Most people today think we're a democracy. We're not. We're created as a republic. We're functioning largely as a democracy now. That was not the intent. It was not the intent to be a democracy, okay? Some comparisons between democracies and republics. Here are some characteristics. A democracy is government direct by the majority. Majority rules. So that's why we have such emphasis on opinion polls these days. Once they manipulate a poll to show that 51% of the American people think something should be, then it should be. That's democracy in action. A republic, on the other hand, the government is indirect through representatives who are bound by oath to a higher law. Okay? Democracy is ruled by men. Republic is the rule of law. And the source of all law ultimately is God himself, lest we forget. Democracy is characterized by demagogism, agitation, and something that Benjamin Rush called mobocracy. Republic is characterized by statesmanship, liberty, and justice. Democracy, individual minority rights are not secure. Why? Because the majority can vote them away. A republic is the only system of government in which individual and minority rights are truly secure. This comes from a document published in 1928, the U.S. Army Training Manual, and it was issued to all members of the military to educate them on the principles of the Constitution, because they were taking an oath above and beyond the oath that politicians take. They are laying their lives literally on the line for this document. So they considered that it was wise that we teach them what it is that they are laying their lives on the line to protect. Wise decision. Unfortunately, when FDR was elected president, he didn't like this particularly, and he ordered that all copies of this be gathered and destroyed. And it was so. You can find it on the internet. I encourage you to go and read it. If you don't believe this, it's there. It's on the internet. I'm still looking for a hard copy. One was bound to slip through the cracks someplace. If somebody can find one for me, I'll pay big bucks for it. Republic or democracy? Okay, Article 4, Section 4 says the United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a republican form of government. Republicanism is not the phantom of a deluded imagination. On the contrary, laws under no form of government are better supported, liberty and property better secured, or happiness more effectually dispensed to mankind. Our first president, George Washington. Second president, John Adams. Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide, and they knew because they had studied their history. Our third president, Thomas Jefferson. The Republican is the only form of government which is not eternally at open or secret war with the rights of mankind. Our fourth president, Madison, also one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. He wrote in Federalist 10, democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Another author of the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton, we are a republic. Real liberty is never found in despotism or in the extremes of democracy. The third author, John Jay, who was also the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said, pure democracy, like pure rum, easily produces intoxication, and with it 1,000 pranks and fooleries. I do not expect mankind will, before the millennium, be what they ought to be. And therefore, in my opinion, every political theory which does not regard them as being what they are will prove abortive. However, there's a more modern political philosopher named Karl Marx who wrote in the Communist Manifesto, the first step in the revolution is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy. Betty Knowles Hunt was a journalist who wrote extensively in the 1950s, and she shared this: "Perhaps as a people, we are not strong enough to be free. If that is the case, then we shall certainly lose our freedom. And it will not matter what ism supplants Americanism. But this will not prove that our free way of life was not the best way. It will only prove that we were not worthy of it." Modern commentarians, H.L. Mencken: "Democracy is a pathetic belief in the collective wisdom of individual ignorance." Churchill: "The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter." And there you have 7 doctrines of Constitution, which established a republic by the people's will. It is man's best law. It is not God's perfect law. But as James 1:25 says, "One who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, and abides by it, this man will be blessed in what he does." And 2 Corinthians 3:17 reminds us that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Every word of it, says James Madison, decides a question between power and liberty. Ladies and gentlemen, the Constitution is all about liberty. So the next time you see the flag and the 7 red stripes, let it also remind you of these 7 doctrines: fidelity to Declaration principles, original intent, enumerated powers, separation of powers, balance of powers, representation, and reserved individual rights. I think those powers need organizing. That's better. I thank you, and we'll take some questions.